Ladies and gentlemen, if I could ask you to gather up your coffee and drinks and desserts and take your seat. It's time for the second panel. And I will, in the interest of time, I will cut short the usual effusive comments and biographies of our speakers. We are going to have each of the speakers present in turn, and then all of them will come up for question and answer with the audience. And we've asked each of the presentations to be limited to about 10 minutes so that we will have ample time for discussion with the audience. Building on the very rich content of the first panel, at least of my Italian colleagues who made their contributions, I would like to turn first to my colleague at the Peterson Institute, Carolyn Freund, senior fellow and former senior economist and at the World Bank, who has been with us now for about a year, and one of our great new additions on the Institute staff. And Carolyn will make a presentation based on her extensive economic research, which I think will be of great interest to the business interests here in the audience. So without further ado, Carolyn, let me ask you to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. So the presentation I put together today on TTIP is about this idea of aligning regulatory policies across the EU and the US and looking to one sector, because sectors are so different it's very hard to talk about them together. So this is sort of evidence from autos, but I think a lot of the general ideas can cut across different sectors. So just if you look at what's on the actual website of our different commissions, the European Commission and the USTR, the United States Trade Representative here, what we see is something very similar: greater regulatory compatibility between the EU and US and paving the way for setting global standards. That's the EU objective. The US objective: TTIP can set high standards and pioneer new rules for the global trading system. So it's really about two things, this agreement, or the big part of it is two things: market integration and first mover advantage. So getting the regulatory systems aligned, and then not only is that important for the US and EU, but if the US and EU are able to do this, the rest of the world is very likely to follow. So there's a very important first mover advantage here if the US and EU are able to undertake this big commitment. And 80% of the economic gains from the type of models that Jeff was posting come from adjustment in NTBs. So this is where it's important to look at a sector. So if you want to look at the auto sector, what are we really talking about? Well, we're talking about the fact that autos go under very different regulations depending on where they're marketed. So just as a personal example, my grandmother used to live in Germany, and when she could no longer drive, we wanted to bring her Mercedes over. Well, it turned out it would cost more to bring that car over and get it adjusted than to buy a new Mercedes here. And this is what we see. So there's, a difference in the length between the windshield and the metal. There's difference in the type of crash testing that's done. There's all these differences, so much so that a Ford Fusion's global parts are only 80% the same. So it's almost like a different product in each market. And the Ford Fusion is one of the cars that's most homogeneous. So other cars that are the same model, same make, same color, everything, can be even more different than that. And some estimates from Equurus suggest that regulations are equivalent to about a 25% tariff in autos, even higher than that in food, and similar or slightly lower in some of the other industries. Well, this raises the question, of course, of, well, is one standard better? And I think the hardest thing about this agreement is getting the regulatory agencies on board to make these changes. And if we just look at fatalities per registered vehicles, so this isn't per population, it's per actual cars that are on the street, EU and US are extraordinarily similar. So there's much more variation within the EU that all have the same standards than there is between the EU and the US. So the EU 15 do better than the US, but the EU as a whole does slightly worse, but it's owing to some of the new members that may have other road issues or that are slightly different. So one way of thinking about it, if we just look at this statistic of safety versus per capita income, it's much more closely associated with per capita income than with standards. So both of our standards seem to be working. They're different, but they seem to be doing the same thing. I think there are a lot of lessons from the EU single market that we should be thinking about when we think about about regulatory harmonization between the US and the EU. Once that happened, we see trade taking off both within the EU, so around 92, but also US to the EU. So US to the EU and internal EU trade in autos really takes off once the EU common market comes into effect, leaving the rest of the world behind. We also see a dramatic increase in the share of foreign registrations. These were the years that were available or that I found. And actually most of that increase is within EU. So French buying German cars instead of French cars, or Italians buying Spanish cars instead of Italian, or any of these Germans buying some French or Italian cars. That's what changed following the EU. So here's, if we go down to the firm level of autos, what you can see is that there's a real rationalization over time, where initially a lot of companies basically have their home market in the EU, and then as the industry gets combined into a European industry, you get a very standard trade pattern where the top company has about twice as much as the second company, 3 times as much as the third company, and so on. So there's this kind of rationalization that happens over time. But what's interesting is the non-European access actually fell as a share. So because of this harmonization, it helped the internal market, and people are actually buying more foreign cars, but they're buying less non-European cars. And the US and European markets look very similar to each other in terms of market shares, with the biggest company having a much bigger share and then moving down the line in this sort of what we call power law type way. But they're very different companies. So there's certainly room for a lot of rationalization across the two markets. So regulatory barriers pose sunk costs and variable costs. So there's a real deadweight loss here because there's no tariff revenue. So in normal trade agreements, when we think of removing the tariff, you lose the tariff revenue. When you harmonize regulations, if both regulations are good, it's a pure gain. And it's even a gain to the rest of the world because they can sell the same product to both markets. So it's a pure gain. Some models have left the US market, such as the Alfa Romeo at some point, because developing a car for the US market was just too expensive. But once you harmonize, smaller brands or smaller models from the bigger brands can start to come in. You can produce one model for the whole world. So there's just these huge kind of gains that are very different from what we normally think about in these models. So I think they're much bigger than the type of gains that we see when we do a CGE, because there's this variety gain and this real gain in production costs that come from reducing regulatory barriers. And the final thing I want to talk about is why now? So EU and US exports, EU and US together are, and this is including intra-European trade, are a huge percent of global trade. Even bigger within autos, more than 50%. So setting standards first gives others the incentive to follow. And let's just look in autos what the market looks like now. So this is the world map weighted by vehicle stock. So who's consuming, where the vehicles are sitting. You really see two big lumps here, the US and the EU. Scroll out 10 years to what's expected in the future, or 20 years, I'm sorry, to what's expected in the future, and there's a new lump that's coming in. So setting the standards now is so important before cars are being produced and sold everywhere. So getting this done now is just critical. So to conclude, TTIP is about regulatory convergence and first mover advantage. The gains go beyond the standard gains from tariff reduction because there's no loss in tariff revenue. It's pure productivity, prices, variety, and there's no diversion that you would normally have because it's a pure productivity gain, a real competitiveness. US and EU manufacturing can be rationalized together and both improve their competitiveness with respect to the rest of the world. And the timing is critical. Doing this sooner rather than later can make a big difference for EU and US exports. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. A model of clarity and succinctness, and hopefully our following panelists will even exceed her achievement in that score. So the test is next for Dr. Daniel Krause, who is the Deputy Director General of Confindustria, a long association with the group, and a very distinguished career in Italian business and in U.S. academics, and was a Rhodes Scholar, it says on his biography, in 1972, which some people wouldn't think is a big deal, but 1972 means he beat me out for the scholarship, so I find that very impressive. I turn the floor over to Daniel Krause.
Thanks to everyone. Well, I will bring the point of Italian industry, and I will start by saying that Italian industry fully supports the negotiations for a comprehensive and ambitious transatlantic trade and investment partnership. And I think that for clarity, the reason was explained very well by the previous speaker. Once marginal costs decrease over time, it's evident that there is an advantage in taking away all barriers and all tariffs. A transatlantic agreement will have a significant economic impact on both economies by promoting economic growth and by creating new jobs. In addition, I believe it will strengthen the transatlantic partnership politically and strategically, affirming its positive impact on the global economy and on the world trading system. This is the reason why Confindustria has supported for a long time and in a convinced way a deeper transatlantic and economic integration, and will continue to advocate a high-quality agreement. The TTIP is by far, as it has been explained before this morning, the most important agreement the European Union has ever engaged in, under all angles, the economic one, the commercial one, the financial, the political. Provided a sufficient level of ambition is maintained, its conclusions will help the ongoing recovery, support economic growth, support job creation, and contribute to invert the increasing tendency towards protectionist actions. We must always start reasoning that the crisis has increased the protectionist ambitions of many countries. And it will also help the WTO in coming out of the moving sands after the encouraging conclusions of the Trade Facilitation Agreement on Bali last December. I think, as it has been explained very well by Minister Calenda before, we have to aim at bringing some results starting from the belief that the TTIP is an integration agreement. It's not only a tariff agreement, and it's an integration agreement in a globalization age, and therefore I think we have to respond to the globalization threats and the positive aspects of globalization by giving correct answers. I think what has been said this morning, that if the business finds the solutions sectorially, that is on the vertical integration function, the game is over. There is no regulatory constraint that can somehow overcome what is the industry's interest and the industry needs. This is why, if we want to achieve a goal, and I think that this country that is a leader, historical leader of the free market, should not be bypassed by mercantilist approaches and mercantilist interests, which I think are short-term safety measures that do not at all pay in the longer term. So now I will look at the three pillars very quickly because I don't want to take over too much time. Well, I think in the area of market access, I think the agreement that has been explained should remove all existing tariffs, barriers to investment and services, and should improve the movement of people in the transatlantic market. I think this is an ambitious goal. We could go step by step, of course. As I said, it's an integration agreement. But I think that in addition to this, the TTIP should lead to a better access also in the whole issue of public procurement markets at all levels of government, and for a standstill on all binational provisions. I know this of the public procurement is a hairy issue. We don't have to solve it tomorrow, but I think it should be affronted and confronted, the issue, because it is an issue that somehow must be resolved if we want to have an efficient, fully trading area. More specifically, as far as tariffs are concerned, it has to be noted that despite the average low level of tariff protection, as it has been said also by President Marcegaglia, there are still some peaks that hinder access to the US market, and the removal of duties in sectors like the shoe industry and whatever, which has high duties, given the extent of the exchange of trade, could deliver immediate and reasonably valuable results. In the second pillar, the field of investment, the agreement should not only aim at ensuring that EU companies' investment will be protected in the United States, for instance, by enshrining in the TTP key principles like the national treatment and the fair and equitable treatment, but should grant neutrality in the case of conflict through a comprehensive investor-to-state dispute settlement, the famous ISDS mechanism. I think that a well-designed mechanism of investor-to-state dispute settlement allows for protection and adequate compensation of foreign companies' investment in cases of direct or indirect expropriation, or where there is absence of fair and equitable treatment. The mechanism will also enable investors to launch legal action on neutral grounds and without politically sensitive consideration if a state breaches the rule established in the agreement. As far as the public procurement is concerned, of course, the final aim is to liberalize it at all levels of government, federal, state, and local. And I think it should go beyond what we are discussing at the WTO level, that is the WTO Agreement on Government Procurement, the GPA. But this should be done to principle of national treatment, and I think the whole issue of the binational and the Jones Act and all of these can be treated over time. I don't think that we can force a reconsideration in the short term of local content requirements, the famous Berry Amendment. I think these issues can take their time. The problem is that if we have an ongoing process, all the results, all the problems will be solved at the end. And in the area of regulatory cooperation, which is, I think, one of the very important areas, the agreement should aim at developing a mechanism to achieve regulatory coherence on the horizontal level, including early consultations, impact assessment, and regulatory review, but also on the vertical level. And the agreement should also define an institutional process and procedural requirements for regulator-to-regulator cooperation, only in case, after the negotiations have been concluded, only in case in which the sectors cannot reach an agreement. But once the sectors, as it has been said, reach the agreement, I think that agreement does not necessitate useless regulatory additional products. And the regulatory divergence, in fact, I think, has constituted and still does constitute a real fixed cost for business, and in some sectors quite a high cost, such as engineering, machinery, electronics, and chemicals. This is a high cost, and therefore it reduces market access and reduces company competitiveness. And the parties, I think, have made it clear that they have no intention of amending their own legislation, and therefore the approach must resolve around the mutual recognition and or the adoption of common international standards. And I think common international standards in some sectors, some of which have already been mentioned in the roundtable before, could prove a valuable example. Finally, let me just say 2 words on the development of global rules, because I think the development of such global rules will strengthen the transatlantic partnership as well as the whole world trading system. And therefore we call on all EU and US negotiators to have to negotiate ambitious rules, in particular also to regard to the access of raw materials and energy. I think that these 2 issues, the raw material issue and the energy issue, are very important issues to affront over time. And I think that I speak for the Italian industry, the interest is very great here, because an important outcome of the agreement could be the establishment of transparent and non-discriminatory rules in the energy field and also in the raw material fields through the adoptions of WTO plus provision as a mechanism. And therefore, I think, and I conclude, that by improving market access conditions, the TTIP will also contribute and could contribute in rebalancing the market situation by providing European companies a wider choice of energy and raw materials, and bringing new suppliers to the market can potentially lead to lower energy and raw material prices for industrial uses in Europe. And this is why it's so important that these 2 arguments be put in the agenda for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Krause. Our next speaker is Marjorie Darlings, who is the Vice President for European Affairs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Marjorie is well known to many people here in Washington, has had experience in the Congress, which is very important, working for a very distinguished senator, Senator Danforth, whose family is one of the pillars of St. Louis. Is also very important private sector experience at Motorola and Lockheed Martin, and I think that enriches her insights in her new job as Vice President at the Chamber. So Marjorie, the floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks first to the Peterson Institute and the Embassy of Italy for inviting me to participate in today's event. I feel very fortunate, very honored to do so. I also want to say hello again to my friends from the Business Europe delegation, to Minister Calenda, and also to members of the Confindustria delegation. It's a pleasure to see you again. Hopefully this won't be too redundant for you. Look, I'm not going to speak for 10 minutes, although I could, but I am simply going to say a couple of highlights. One, we've heard all the reasons why we must do this agreement. We've talked about the benefits, we've talked about the geostrategic imperative, we've talked about the so-called setting the gold standard, or as Kathleen put it, the first mover advantage, which I think is a great way to describe it. And we've covered that pretty well. We can do it. We've demonstrated a desire to do it. We've indicated a willingness on both sides to do it. We can get this done. There are a bunch of challenges, many of which have been articulated here, whether it's public opinion and the rising tide of negativism, in particular in Europe, whether it's politics, which is just one of those immovable objects that you confront whenever you're trying to deal with good policy issues, whether it is missed signals, which is clearly what happened with regard to the initial tariff offers, my opinion, whether it is reticence on the part of our regulators. Again, on both sides of the Atlantic, there's a natural tendency to want to default to what you're most comfortable with. And by forcing the regulators to come to, not forcing, by creating the right environment for the regulators to come to the table, by creating the politically necessary push for the regulators to come to the table, they are being taken out of their comfort zone. And they're being asked to consider things in a different light. That's a challenge. It's a challenge on both sides of the Atlantic. It's one that can be overcome. It's one that will be overcome in more sectors as we move forward. Look, yesterday, while we were hosting President Barroso and our friends from Business Europe and Confindustria, and the minister, in the room next door, there was some noise while we were trying to have a conversation, and it was, in fact, the U.S.-EU Insurance Symposium, which was next door. The room was packed. It was even more packed than our room because you had businesses, insurance businesses from both the U.S. and from Europe. You had regulators from all 50 states, because if you want to talk about a complicated regulatory structure, insurance look no further, and European regulators as well. There's an example of a dialogue that's actually working quite well, and where progress has and continues to be made in finding ways to eliminate or limit the impact of the differences. That's a great example. We know there's been work done in autos, in chemicals, in pharmaceuticals, in medical devices, and so on, where the industry has come together. The Chamber, along with Business Europe, hosted last year anyway, the US-EU Regulatory Cooperation Forum. That's the place where US and European businesses and US and European regulators get together. And in many of those cases, US and European businesses made joint presentations. They've made joint submissions to both the USTR and also to the European Commission on what we can achieve in this agreement. So clearly there is a lot of work that's already been done, but we have to recognize the fact that we are up against some natural reticence on the part of our regulators, which is why that political impetus is so critically important. I think we also have to recognize that we need to maintain very high expectations for what this agreement is about. It does need to be comprehensive, it does need to be ambitious, it does need to be creative. because we have a tremendous opportunity here that we may not have again. It's taken us a long time to get here. We've brought some people reluctantly to the table. I think if you look in the agricultural community on both sides of the Atlantic, there are folks who would just as soon, who are of the belief, who are skeptical about the prospect for progress. Let's put it that way. But the opportunity is upon us and the imperative is there. So the question really is, what do we have to do in terms of next steps? Yesterday, when we were chatting with our Business Europe friends and our Confindustria friends, we talked about two very important things. One, how do we as the business community urge our respective governments to demonstrate that strong political will that's necessary, that commitment that helps to overcome the missed signals around things like tariff offers. That's number one. And then number two, how do we work together to help counter that rising tide of negativism that is, I would say, further advanced in Europe, but clearly is starting to be heard here as well, whether it's around ISDS or whether it's around concerns about what the regulatory cooperation and coherence piece of this puzzle looks like and so on. I would say that we have our work cut out for us. The Chamber is leading sort of a multifaceted business coalition for transatlantic trade. We're doing that in conjunction with our friends at the Transatlantic Business Council and some others. It's populated by hundreds of companies who are committed to seeing this agreement go through. Our role is really twofold. One, to provide substantive inputs to the negotiators, and two, to provide and generate that political support that's necessary to get this deal done. We work very closely with our friends at Business Europe. We work very closely with the member federations, for which we are very grateful. We are planning a series of forums this summer and fall across Europe to convey the message that U.S. and European business are together in our desire to see this deal done. I would submit to you, just in closing, that I think having the delegations here this week is incredibly important, because you have conveyed a very powerful message to our negotiators, and you will when you meet with Mike Froman later today. You've conveyed a very important message about the need to stay focused and to move forward and to not be held back by sort of traditional negotiating strategies. I will say to you, my challenge to you is to encourage your members, our counterparts in the European business community, to stand up and convey the same messages in Brussels, right? Because it requires ambition on both sides. And it's frankly too easy for our negotiators or the naysayers to want to fall back into a place where it's too hard, it can't be done, the politics aren't there, we're waiting for the other side to move. We have to get past that. It's up to the business community to speak with one voice where we can, and to make clear that the gains are so significant that we can't lose this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marjorie. I think you've added another criteria for the consideration of negotiators. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. In some areas, the wheel is there and it's rolling. Just put it on the car and get going. So that leads me to our final panelist, Shane Carr, who's Vice President for Federal Government Affairs of the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers. Shane has also formerly been an Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Transportation, and he also has had service in the Congress working for a very distinguished representative from Nebraska, Doug B. Reuter, who was a great friend of our institute and an enormously important servant of the U.S. government. After Shane's comments, I will ask all of the panelists to come to the podium, and we'll be able to have time to have questions and answers on all their presentations with all of you. So turn the floor over to Shane.
Thank you, and I guess my job is the easy job because I'm sort of batting cleanup, and Caroline's really covered the economics very well earlier, so that makes my job particularly easy. Let's see if I can figure out the PowerPoint. First of all, I want to thank the Peterson Institute and the Embassy of Italy for hosting this event and for inviting me here. I really benefited actually very much from hearing the speakers before lunch, and I very much associate myself, and I think our sector would associate itself with the minister's characterization of TTIP as an integration of the two markets and not just a free trade agreement. I think we're very much in agreement with that point of view. So to that end, let's just walk through a few things. I think it's been stated already, we are the largest manufacturing, the automotive is the largest manufacturing and export sector for both the US and EU. That makes us very interested in seeing an ambitious agreement reached, but with all due respect, we believe that it should also make the two governments very interested in concluding an agreement in which the automotive sector is a key portion. As has been already noted multiple times, the tariffs are low. Tariffs are low in our sector, and the much bigger barrier to trade, the NTB, is our regulatory barriers. And so that is our focus, as several of the previous speakers have mentioned, getting to regulatory convergence. And I would also say, just in wrapping up this slide, that, again, several people have mentioned the importance of a strong US and EU agreement toward overall global regulatory convergence. And I would just reinforce this notion that our two markets combined really set the stage for continued global leadership, in particular in our sector. Sort of some background facts. I think actually, I won't spend much time on this slide, but I think the key point is the EU and US are the second and third largest producers. The US and EU are the second and third largest markets in the world, right? We have been surpassed by China as of 2013, and I think this slide says producing, but I think those are actually sales numbers, so I apologize for that. But in any case, you can see that China has surpassed either or both the United States and EU as individual markets. However, together, we continue to represent more than a third of the global marketplace. And if this slide doesn't sort of bring home the importance of continued and improved cooperation, I'm not sure what will. So again, we see this as an enormous opportunity in our sector. Again, focus on NTBs as our primary focus, reducing kind of redundancies, and we believe that you can absolutely reduce the regulatory divergence without negatively impacting safety or the environment on either side of the Atlantic. And that's a key point. And for those of you, particularly those of you in town, National Public Radio actually sent a couple of reporters to the New York Auto Show, and they ran a piece just yesterday. And so you can go to their website and listen to this piece, focused exclusively on the issue of the regulatory divergences. And it's a very interesting piece. They interviewed several European automakers and covered such, critical safety features as the coverage of the windshield wipers, the color of the turn signals. There are just a lot of opportunities, I think, for recognition without actually impacting safety performance or outcomes. Some of the anticipated gains, I was glad to see the CEPR cited earlier as a credible source, since we too are very interested in the work that they have done. And then just in closing for us, I would say, these are the principles that we will have used in talking to the governments, the US government and the European side, We think that these are the key to getting, at least in our sector, to a strong agreement. So I'll just run through those quickly. Again, I think we all recognize that political will, as the phrase I've heard used several times here today, is absolutely key. We think that it's there, that it has to be nurtured, but we see political will there. Again, we think that you can do this without impacting vehicle safety and environmental performance. We obviously think it's critical. The reason why we're doing this is to remove barriers, not increase regulatory differences. And along with that fourth bullet, we are not looking to create a third set of regulations as part of this process. And then finally, the definition of mutual recognition from our perspective, very clear, allow an automaker to build a vehicle that can be sold in either market. And just to be clear, we are not anticipating that the entire swath of U.S. and EU regulations would be candidates for mutual recognition in the first agreement. But we do believe that there are areas where the data will show very clearly that mutual recognition is very appropriate and will bring benefits to both sides. And with that, I will close. Let me say thank you again.
Did I call you by the wrong name?
I'm so sorry. It happens all the time. Carolyn.
Our panelists have been very efficient in their time in their presentations, and that leaves us hopefully ample time for a good discussion with you and to answer your questions and engage in your commentary. And so, as we did in the first panel, if anyone wants to start off with the questions, or we have at the mic, please just introduce yourself, say where you work, where you're from, and address your question.
I'm Mark Levinson. I'm with the Congressional Research Service. I'm wondering whether there is any discussion about the applicability of whatever is reached on the automotive front in TTIP to auto producers from third countries.
Why don't we start on that? Okay, I'll take a shot at that. Obviously we are focused on we're focused on the regulatory structure of the U.S. and EU in terms of this agreement, and as you have heard, that is in itself a very significant task. I think that what we see is that to the extent that we are able to bring greater harmonization and recognition to that chart I showed to a third or more than a third of the global marketplace in terms of vehicles, that it really creates a center of gravity that will be helpful in the broader setting of and process of global harmonization.
Excuse me, that really wasn't my question. My question was that there are a number of companies that are based in third countries that manufacture vehicles both in the United States and in the European Union. Is the intention that any agreement that's reached here in the auto sector is applicable to those companies as well?
Yes. Well, absolutely, right? Absolutely. Otherwise, I wouldn't be sitting here because my association represents 12 companies, right? The three Detroit companies, one of whom has a foot on both sides of the Atlantic now, and as well as Toyota, Mazda, Mitsubishi from Japan, and all of the German manufacturers and several of the other European brands, who all are important players in the regulatory process in the United States and in Europe. So as I say, I wouldn't be sitting here if my members didn't think that a strong TTIP that included a regulatory convergence component between US and EU would also benefit them. And that is because they are very significant players in both markets and will have a significant say in ongoing development of regulations in the two markets. Does that get more at your question?
Carolyn, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say from an economic standpoint, if it's mutual recognition, it would certainly affect all producers in each market, so that a third country producer producing in the US then you could sell to either country, so you'd end up in a situation where there can be this kind of rationalization, so you don't have to produce two Camrys in two places, but a Camry here and whatever Corolla there, and then sell the extras. But I think the more interesting thing is that if you actually had harmonization, which is beyond just the mutual recognition, an outsider benefits because he can produce the same car and sell it in either market. So if you're producing outside, the mutual recognition isn't necessarily going to help you. It depends how it's written.
Other questions?
Yes, hi, I'm Kim Frankena from GAO. I wanted to ask about how well positioned we are to engage in the kind of substantive discussion you are talking about. Do we have the statutory authority in place at our regulatory agencies in order to do the mutual recognition or harmonization?
Well, we certainly have statutory authority in place to do harmonization. We've been doing harmonization for a long, long time at the global level. We just haven't been doing it very successfully, to be completely candid. So, will there need to be additional changes to the underlying statutes depending on what's negotiated? Possibly, but certainly we are currently engaged in harmonization. We have the statutory authority, or the DOT has a statutory authority to harmonize.
I just want to jump in here because I didn't mention this during my remarks, but one of the challenges that we have, obviously, when you're talking about regulatory, whether it's cooperation, coherence, whatever you want to put on the tail end of it, is that but for the independent agencies, right, these regulators are subject to oversight by congressional committees. And in many instances, it's those committees that serve as much of a challenge to progress, let's say, as the regulators themselves. So that's another reason why I think helping to shape the public debate is so incredibly important. I'd also just want to say one other thing about regulatory cooperation. A lot has been made of a seeming distinction between what the U.S. is looking for in terms of this, in the regulatory part of the agreement, and what the Europeans are looking for, the so-called horizontal versus sectoral. From our perspective, and I think from the perspective of business on both sides of the Atlantic, it's not an either or. Yeah. It's an all of the above. It's actually a five-part wheel, if you will. The first part being more traditional, right? The sanitary and phytosanitary issues that we know are challenging, but nonetheless are there. The typical technical barriers to trade, like standards and things like that. The regulatory coherence, where you are talking about some basic principles of good regulatory practices, which frankly should apply to all regulators, and that's one of the reasons why we strongly believe that financial services should be included in this agreement. Regulatory cooperation, which is exactly what Shane's been talking about, where it's possible, the sectoral agreements as well, and then creating that mechanism in a way that the Vice Minister was talking about in terms of allowing this to be a living agreement, right? Because we may be able to deal with a number of regulatory divergences in the context of this agreement, but new ones are going to pop up. Hopefully not additional ones, but new ones will pop up over time. Right. And you've got to have that mechanism for ongoing dialogue between our regulators, not only to sort of keep them at it, keep them limber and so on, but to recognize that this is going to be an ongoing process. So I really want to encourage folks, my compatriots in the business community, to not perpetuate this notion, in particular when it comes to regulation, that it's somehow an either or. It's all of the above.
Thank you. Dieter Detke, Georgetown University. One important condition for TTIP success here in the United States is, of course, fast-track authorization for the U.S. government, right? And that seems to be hanging in the balance to some degree. And I want to add one additional difficulty. European Parliament, we need ratification for TTIP in the European Parliament. And what you're seeing over there is also not very helpful, because the European Parliament conditions TTIP on privacy regulations to some degree, and also on a safe haven reform. You know, these are very difficult issues. And Minister Calenda mentioned the European elections, and what's coming up there is also a little bit disturbing, considering that you mentioned the large part of the European public that is so Eurosceptic. Can I have some comments from your side, how this is going to turn out? Thank you.
I think that we have to look at the whole issue starting from a basic concept. I mean, companies must respect regulatory constraints. No one says no. But these regulatory constraints cannot surpass the agreements that the companies can make on both sides of the Atlantic as far as convergence in technical standards is concerned. So I think the role of the political mentor can be one to define the constraint. Define what the regulatory constraint, but not decide what the best way to converge in these standards can be. And I think it's very important that we reason in this way, because if companies find a way in the respect of the regulatory constraint to easen up the technical standard and arrive to a real convergence, I think that the Parliament on both sides of the Atlantic must take this as a given element and not try to recorrect it or readdress it or whatever, because otherwise there is no clear cut in what is the, shall we say, the technological effect, which is always one of lowering marginal cost and therefore giving an advantage to the consumer, and what is the political, shall we say, gain, which is zero. Because I think that the ambition of the manufacturers in reaching this agreement is to give a benefit to the consumer. Why? Because by giving a benefit to the consumer, by lowering prices or making goods more accessible and whatever, at the end, he will have a benefit that he will enlarge in the market, as it has been clearly shown. I mean, that 600-degree increase in India that I think one of the charts showed. Who's going to benefit of that? Well, it's clear that we, on both sides of the Atlantic, want to have a part of that benefit. That benefit can only be reduced by a regulatory standards convergence. So this is the way we have to approach this problem. And I think that there is no real, and let me just say this and take the occasion, there is no conflict by, shall we say, the approach of industry and the approach of policymakers. I mean, we are here in the United States in a mission led by the Deputy Minister for Economic Development, with the producers and with the representatives of companies. And we all have the interest in finding a way in which we'll be better or be better on an equal level playing field. So the problem is how do we maintain this equal level playing field in the best solution? I say by going on the TTIP, that is making progress. Then if the objective is 100 and this year or next year we make a progress of 30, it's an ongoing process, but we have to make something clear, because if we do not make any progress, then I think the integration of which we spoke before will be very difficult.
Jeff, can I just jump in? On the question of TPA or fast track, this strikes me as another example of it's a bit of a red herring that could be tossed out by those who would just as soon see these agreements not go forward. People would say, well, you know, we can't see TPP close because TPA isn't there. We can't see progress in TTIP because TPA isn't there. I would submit to you that you can see, and you are seeing progress on both agreements, and you can move forward without TPA in place at this precise time. I promise you, it will be there. It will be there. It may not be there before November, but it will be there. There's absolutely no reason why that should be viewed as an excuse to hold back in these negotiations.
Let me just add one point on the economics of the consumer benefit. And I think you're absolutely right as far as you went. But the political process is responding to consumer comments that seem to place emphasis on other aspects of consumer interest besides price. And the question whether the consumer groups, the environmental groups, see themselves left out of the process of consultation on the evolving regulatory procedures leads them to be defensive and perhaps not take into full account the economic arguments that you're making. And so I think it's very important, and this applies to the United States and to Washington as well as Brussels, that there has to be an open and inclusive consultative process as we move forward on the TTIP, and TPP too, and so that we can ensure that the objective is to increase employment, increase income, and for the benefit of our people. And that, I think, would be an important thing to keep in mind as we move forward on this these regulatory dialogues of a variety of types that we've been talking about on the panel. Are there other questions or comments from the audience? Let me add a final comment and then a final word of thanks. I think we have started a process of analysis that has shown a great coherence and a great area of mutual benefit for U.S. and European economies, business, workers, consumers, if we would move more quickly on the TTIP. It's important for manufacturing, and I think future work that we will be doing here will also look more closely at how we can take some of these concepts of regulatory cooperation and apply the analysis at a sectoral level to look at industries beyond the auto sector where there's obvious convergence. And I think this is just the start of a work program and research that I know the Peterson Institute will be looking forward to doing and consulting and working very closely with our friends in Europe and particularly in Italy. As a matter of concluding our program today, I want to extend the thanks of the Peterson Institute, most importantly, to our friends at the Embassy of Italy and to the Italian Trade Agency that have been very supportive in giving us the inspiration for having this type of discussion and thinking about how it can enrich our research agenda and our collaboration with our colleagues in Italy and throughout Europe. I think I also have to extend a very special thanks to my colleague Kathleen Cimino, who, without her efforts, first of all, I'd know a lot less about TTIP because she has been a valuable co-author of my work on this, but also she has been really indispensable in organizing this meeting and collaborating with our colleagues in the embassy. And so many thanks to Kathleen. You will hear more about her and read more of her work in the years to come, I'm sure. She is one of our rising stars. And many thanks to our panelists for participating today, from Vice Minister Kalenda for joining us and inspiring our work here. And let me hope that some of the objectives that you have for accelerating the pace of the negotiations will be achieved, and certainly we'll be working to try to develop the intellectual rationale for doing so. So thank you to all. Thank you for coming. Meeting adjourned.